I'm Nate Persley. I'm a law professor here at Stanford and director of the Cyber Policy Center. Welcome, everyone, to our discussion today on the Facebook Oversight Board's decision on the takedown of President Donald Trump's account. We have an all-star panel here today. We're particularly thankful that two members of the Oversight Board have decided to join us today. Our Stanford colleague and former judge, Michael McConnell, and Julie Owono, who is actually here in California, but is leader of the Paris-based group Internet Sans Frontières and is a lawyer and human rights expert as well. Joining me on the Stanford side, we have our all-star team at the Cyber Policy Center, Renee DiResta and Alex Stamos, who both work and lead the Center's Internet Observatory, the Stanford Internet Observatory. Maricha Shake, who is the International Policy Fellow both for the Human-Centered AI program and policy director here at the Cyber Policy Center and former member of the European Parliament. And we are particularly thankful that she is joining us in the wee hours of the night from Amsterdam. And joining us in a few minutes will be Daphne Keller, who leads the program on platform governance here at the Cyber Policy Center. The question and answer function on Zoom, which is probably now familiar to most of humanity that is connected these days, is available to you if you would like to put in a question to our speakers, and you can also upvote or downvote any of the questions there. I thought what we would do is just start with a bit of a lightning round from the speakers on this decision that came down yesterday, and then this will mainly be a discussion between our panelists. Just to level set for those who haven't been following this decision and the environment surrounding it, the Facebook Oversight Board, which was created roughly a year ago, I guess, with appointees drawn from legal academia, human rights organizations, journalism, and the like, has issued about 10 decisions before this most recent and notable one yesterday concerning the account of President Trump, which was suspended on January 6th after content that he posted there relating to the insurrection in the Capitol. The Oversight Board upheld Facebook's decision to take down the account, but in effect remanded it to Facebook in saying that the indefinite suspension that Facebook had imposed on President Trump's account would be should be reevaluated, was inconsistent with the values in the charter of the Oversight Board and as well as international human rights law. And so within 6 months, Facebook has to come back with a better explanation as to why the emergency conditions that existed at the time of the takedown of President Trump's account still exist and justify the continued suspension. In addition, the board articulated other kind of advice with respect to global leaders around the world and how account takedown should function. There's a lot more to say about the decision, and we will hear today, but I thought I would start with the two members of the Oversight Board to get their perspectives. We're now over 24 hours into the news cycle since the decision came down, and so which is a lifetime in internet years. I thought, Michael, I'll start with you and just ask you what now that we've sort of gone through the initial stages of commentary and reflection on this, what would you like people to know either about the board or about the decision itself that people maybe are not aware of?
So, I've only been able to read a small fraction of the coverage and commentary, but I'm really struck by one thing, which is how everyone sees in it not what they want to see, but actually sort of what they don't want to see. It's the opposite of what you would expect from human nature. Everyone seems to treat, or not everyone, but a large part of the coverage and commentary sees one half of it, and it's the half that they disapprove of. But in fact, there's a lot in this opinion that I think both sides of the political spectrum can welcome. I think there's something in this for both sides, and I also think, and I think this has not gotten enough attention, that from the point of view of the general public, in the interest of procedural regularity, clarity, transparency, fairness, that there's something here for everybody, in that it corrects and tries to push Facebook in the direction of being a little less arbitrary and a little clearer in when it makes important decisions.
Julie, what would you add to that? And is giving something to everyone necessarily, is that an indication of the rightness of the opinion here? What should we take from that?
No, we didn't guide our deliberations and decision in looking at what people would like. Doing that would have been very challenging. Instead, what we think is important to highlight here is that anyone who is concerned about what happened on January the 6th, and anyone who is concerned, about Mark Zuckerberg's power and his company's power over our speech online, should actually praise this decision, because the board refused to endorse an arbitrary suspension. That's the first thing. The second thing that I think is important here is we're hearing that, yes, we put the baby back to Facebook, basically, without telling it what it should do. Actually, we did give quite clear guidelines on how it should apply international human rights standards and law when re-examining the case of the former President Trump. So when re-examining whether or not it should apply, what penalty it should apply, whether it should bring him back on, or definitely suspend him. Definitely in terms of setting a date, or permanently disable the account. What we told Facebook is that the company should take into account the severity of the violations that happened on January the 6th, but also should take into consideration the potential for future harms. And this is actually the first time that when talking publicly with a company like Facebook about how influential users are using those incredible platforms to speak to their audiences and beyond. It's the first time that we're actually talking about potential for future harms. And the last thing that I think is important here is the message from the board that all users matter, and that it's not because you are a head of state that you have more right than others to spew hateful content, fake content, and you will not be punished for that. For instance, because what you say is newsworthy. On the contrary, what we're telling is that yes, these normal users, they have rights, of course, but also because they are influential, they have more responsibility to protect public safety and to assess whether or not they use their influence in order not to protect public safety. We encouraged Facebook to look at guidance that exists out there, including guidance on the Rabat Plan of Action against hate that was adopted in the framework of the United Nations, and that gives clear indications with regards to context, what you should look at when you're trying to, basically delete hate from writing, from publications, or from social media platforms. I think these are, I would say, my main takeaway.
I want to turn to the rest of folks, but let me just ask this question just for clarification's sake. So suppose on Facebook and I get this decision, what evidence on the ground would I need to marshal in order to either justify the suspension or not justify the suspension? Is it that, presumably you all agreed that January 6th, that the evidence existed there because that's why you uphold the suspension, but did the US how do we know whether the clear and present danger that existed and which you all agreed justifies the account suspension? When will we know if that that disappears because in many respects, we didn't really know that on January 5th. It's only because of what happened on January 6th. So what should Facebook do in kind of response to this? How are they supposed to articulate the rationale for why the danger that existed on January 6th has actually dissipated? Julie, why don't you start? If Michael, if you want to add after Julie, then please do.
One thing that I think is interesting is that we've made some recommendations with regards to that precisely. Currently, Facebook doesn't have any community standards or policies that clearly deals with emergency situations. This is not science fiction. You know, the case of the Capitol riots is something that probably could have happened or has happened with other extents elsewhere in the world. And that's precisely what we're telling the company, that it should be prepared. But to be prepared, we need rules that are clear, that are transparent, and that can, that through which we can hold the company accountable. That's what I would say. I don't know if Michael would like to.
Michael, you're teaching First Amendment law right now here at Stanford. What would you say to that point?
Well, I think the one of the important things here is that we did not try to prejudge what that decision is going to be. Now, you're asking what kinds of evidence to look at. I think we don't know what 6 months from now are going to, what are going to be the circumstances. But our decision requires a forward-looking examination, and by then we'll know a lot of things. The dangers that presented themselves on January 6th and January 7th were an interaction between Mr. Trump's tweets and various, using the terminology of the Facebook community standard that was applied, dangerous individuals and organizations who were in fact organizing the events in Washington. They didn't come about as a spontaneous matter of responding immediately to Mr. Trump or anyone else. They were planned in advance, and Mr. Trump's Facebook and other communications were an important part of that. But we'll presumably 6 months from now, we'll know whether that kind of activity is continuing. We will know what kinds of messages that Mr. Trump is now communicating to the nation. He just started his new social media. It's not really a platform, but a vehicle for his communication. So it's not as if we won't know what sorts of preoccupations that he has. We also know some things about what are the dangers, what are the particular dangers that come from leaders who post material, and Facebook will be able to look to that. But we, the board, did not specify what kind of evidence. That will be Facebook's job. And then in the event that it comes back to the board, we may have another opportunity to cogitate about all of this. But the main thing is that they need to evaluate this in light of the severity of the conduct and the forward-looking question of potential harm.
Great. Well, now, Alex, you used to be head of security at Facebook. You've read this opinion now. I guess put on both your Facebook hat and then also your hat as head of the Internet Observatory, having issued the report of you and Renee and your three other partners, the report of the Election Integrity Partnership on disinformation in the 2020 election. What do you make of the decision, both wearing your former hat and your current one?
Yeah, so I no longer have a Facebook hat, yeah. So first off, thank you, Mike and Julie, so much for coming today. I guess I have thoughts on the meta issue of the Oversight Board and then on the decision itself. So on the meta issue, there's a lot of cynicism and sarcasm in the discussion among kind of the tech skeptical press and such, what you might call kind of the cool kids club, of where there's always an upside to kind of taking anything cynically, right? And not believing that there's anything positive that can come out of anything. And people talk about like the board is just a fig leaf and a plant and stuff. So I gave a speech like 3 years ago when I left Facebook, and I talked about like some of the fundamental problems. And 3 of the fundamental problems I talked about was 1, that there was no kind of transparency in the decisions that the company made. 2, that there was no kind of predictability in the decisions that were made. And 3, that the people making the decisions were too close to the people whose job it was to keep the company on the right side of governments, right? That the policy team that does this work also reports to the same person whose job is government affairs. And that was like a fundamental weakness in kind of Facebook policy. So on a meta issue, I think the Oversight Board actually addresses, one of the reasons I like the existence is addresses those 3 issues, right? We have some transparency around why the decision was made, as well as a forcing function of the Oversight Board forcing transparency from the company on data issues and such that otherwise we wouldn't get. We have, we're not quite there yet, but the outcome of this process is hopefully something that gives predictability that we can have, in the same way that court systems have, precedent that can be applied and can be assumed to be applicable, that will have that out of this rulemaking process. And the Oversight Board obviously does not care at all about what Donald Trump thinks about Facebook, right? And other world leaders. So I think like from a meta issue, I am glad that this is happening. And I think there's a lot of people who are, it's fun to be cynical, but then they don't have any better idea. And the truth is if you're going to, a lot of these problems are the emergent problems of allowing strangers to talk to one another. You will always have to have rules that are mediating this kind of behavior. And those rules are going to have to be created or at least looked at in some kind of mechanism. And this is, out of all the horrible options, this seems to be the least bad option so far. So I am glad to have seen this kind of process-wise. On the decision itself, I agree about keeping him down. I signed an amicus brief, I guess you would say, along the 9,860 some other comments that were talked about, like there's a good reason to have a deference towards democratically elected leaders, but that deference should have a limit where those leaders are utilizing the platform to actually attack democracy itself. So this is the kind of outcome I was actually hoping for and talked about publicly. I think I have kind of 2 questions, and one, I have no problem. I don't think like they punted it, because this is the process by which decisions have to be made inside the companies, right? Which is there's something that happens. You have to study it. You have to pull data out of it. And then you have to have like an iterative process where you talk about what kind of policies, and then you have to test those against a variety of other situations to think about what the real world impact is. So the fact that back and forth is now going to be at least partially public is a huge benefit, because there's a bunch of other companies that just made a decision in the boardroom and haven't revisited at all and have kept their heads down. There's a certain video company that video site that nobody ever talks about that still has Trump up, right? And so like the fact that there's some kind of back and forth invisibility, transparency here, I think is actually a good thing. But what I would like to see out of that back and forth is a couple of things. One, I did like the use of the Rabat framing, the kind of human rights 6-point test of like analyzing the speech. I think an interesting place for the review board to think about next is about that explicit trade-off between Facebook respecting the rights of people to choose who their democratic leaders are and not getting involved in democratic processes versus the possible abuse of the platform. And that was not very explicit. So I would love to see more in the future conversations, kind of an explicit discussion, because this is a decision about Donald Trump, but really the people who really need to care about it are named Modi and Bolsonaro and the citizens of a variety of other democracies where Facebook is being used to cause harm currently by democratically elected leaders. And I think that needs to be a more explicitly discussed about that trade-off. And then the second kind of the second thing I think the board needs to consider is this is under like a policy that is used on really exigent circumstances of like, there's an immediate possibility of violence. And in all of these situations where you have governments that are abusing Facebook, the vast majority of time, it's not like something's immediately going to happen or is happening at the moment. There's a slow buildup of abusive language and this is a history of Facebook. Like one of the fundamental problems we had going into the 2016 election is the company didn't have good policies on content that was a borderline content where a single piece of content was not violating or had the single piece of content would have an issue around who posted it, but it was collectively all the content together caused lots of harm, right? And so that's how we got the coordinated and authentic behavior policy and a bunch of other policies that came out of that. That needs to be part of the consideration here, is that the vast majority of times that you're going to be making a judgment about a democratically elected leader, it's not going to be because they're saying rush the Capitol right now. It's going to be because they are lying and manipulating people in a way that maybe has really bad downstream harm, where each piece of content is not as high of a bar. And I think that's something I'd love to see explicitly kind of in the future decision.
Renee, why don't you pick up on that, particularly in light of the study and work that you guys did over the last year on disinformation?
Yeah, well, a lot of what we saw leading up to the events at the Capitol was it wasn't a one-off thing, per the point about that Alex just made at the end there about this is the where the immediate incitement to violence that actually precipitated the takedown was not something that happened in a vacuum. It was something that was really built up over a very large period of time. And while some of the content had been violating previously, ultimately it received maybe a label, a fact check sometimes, but it was really seen as something that should stay up because it was newsworthy. And the newsworthiness exemption, I think, which the Oversight Board did allude to in its decision, is interesting because in many ways it's like an indemnification for the powerful, right? It says that if you are very, very powerful, your speech is inherently newsworthy. Ergo, it for some reason it receives a higher standard of protection, if you will, whereas a regular lowly person making the same comment would come down under the policy because they don't have the newsworthiness protection. So it's this interesting dynamic of the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Depending on who you are with that account, your speech is more or less protected, which in many ways is the reverse, I would say, of how we should be thinking about this. And you did see the board kind of allude to that too. The idea that with great power should come great responsibility, should come more responsibility because you actually have the potential to incite in a meaningful way, whereas your inciting words will be, you have the potential to actually have them acted upon by your audience of millions, as opposed to you, the guy with 10 followers, saying the same thing, and your 10 followers are not going to go storm the Capitol. So there was that. But one thing that we saw repeatedly during the election in the election integrity partnership work was the repeated the kind of ways in which the narrative built up over time, such that you started to see actually people self-assembling around the same ideas. And that was a really interesting dynamic that I think Facebook alluded to in that document that was leaked this week. This was last week, I guess I should say now, that BuzzFeed had, where they articulate the fact that the claims that were made, the kind of the perpetual, persistent delegitimization that violated their policies but was allowed to stand under newsworthiness, presumably, that had the effect of leading people to believe a certain thing. And then those people sort of self-assembled and began to set up groups and things in response to this. And they made this very interesting comment in this leaked document that they didn't see it as a movement until it was too late. They saw it as individual isolated decisions, individual isolated creation of groups, when ultimately what was happening was responses to this sort of perpetual and repetitive framing.
Thank you. So Alex mentioned the sort of the international context, and since Maricha, you're the only one right now who's outside the U.S., even though Julie sometimes is. Can you talk about this from an international perspective, perhaps? I mean, that is, I think, people, particularly, most of the commentary is coming from the U.S. press and U.S. pundit class, but this has implications for around the world. And while you and many, and actually probably everyone on this call, has advocated for greater legislation and greater government action, as Alex says, that hasn't been forthcoming. And so the Oversight Board is sort of this second, third, or fifth best solution to these problems. What, just from an international perspective, what would you sort of want people to think about?
Well, it couldn't be underlined more how important it is that Facebook is a globally operating company, and that the harms that it causes by either intervening, for example, currently taking down critical posts against Indian government policy, or not taking down other evidently harmful posts, for example, by world leaders in the Philippines, in Brazil, or elsewhere, previously in Myanmar, where genocide was essentially drummed up on Facebook. And so I think it's really important to remember that Facebook has the choice, with or without its oversight board, to decide to draw stronger, principled, moral lines every day, and they've not done that. And it's probably out of business considerations or otherwise, but I think that that is a painful lesson that could have been learned far before President Trump accounts Takedown, and there will be more lessons to be learned. And I hope that the oversight board won't distract from the need to address those very significant harms worldwide. And so what I see is a company with outsized power, where the oversight board has a limited mandate to address a limited set of cases, and it takes a long time to address them, which, you know, I understand there's input, there were thousands of comments offered, and obviously deliberation takes time. But for more systematic and also more principled, less arbitrary approach to the role of Facebook, indeed, I've made the case for democratically anchored, rule of law anchored methods that are truly independent of the company. And sure, if you look to Washington, maybe that is not forthcoming, but if you look to Brussels, it is. There is a Digital Services Act that is now going through the legislative pipeline that seeks to spell out more clearly what the responsibilities and liabilities of companies, not just Facebook, thankfully also that one important video sharing platform called YouTube that has gotten away with a lot of harm, not only around January 6th, but also more broadly conspiracy theories, anti-vaxxers, and so on and so forth. So a systematic approach, I think, is incredibly important, where the public interest is leading, and where it's not, you know, in one way or another, also a PR exercise of a big tech platform. So what I hope is that with this individual case and with a sort of scorecard for what the oversight board has, you know, done well or has not done well, or this, you know, personal opinions about this moment in time, is that the systematic, large-scale, ongoing problem of harms shared and spread from Facebook into the real world, causing death, polarization, and violence is not lost.
Thank you. Now, Daphne, I introduced you before you joined, so I promise you I gave you your due. You've heard what Maricha said about greater government intervention. You've talked about a little bit the sort of middle range solution that comes up with the oversight board. What were your thoughts on yesterday's decision?
Well, so I thought that the board had a very, very thorny problem to solve, and they solved it rather elegantly. And the way that we can tell that the solution was elegant maybe is from today's Politico headline, "Facebook's political nightmare deepens." So, which is talking about Democrats and Republicans both being even more mad in the wake of the decision. So I have I'm a lawyer, I have a couple of fairly lawyerly observations about the ruling. One is about this kind of intriguing mix of, like, part of the elegance of the solution is this, you know, Marbury moment of saying, you only get to ask us the questions that you have properly teed up, and we tell you how to tee up the questions. But then after being so particular and productively particular in that way, the opinion also gave in to the temptation to just throw out a whole bunch of recommendations on things that had not been teed up, where there was no, you know, evidence in place, arguments had not been heard, and where maybe conventional wisdom deserves evidence and arguments. So I think while it is tempting to do that, maybe there should be a limit to dicta. The other thing, so I'm going to be kind of a devil's advocate here, and this responds a little to what Alex was saying. And I really am being a devil's advocate, so please don't take this as, you know, Daphne came out and said companies should do X. But are they really supposed to ignore economic and political pressure? Like, when they make a decision that will definitely cause a bunch of advertisers to go away and make them lose money, or definitely cause political backlash that will have consequences for them, is the standard that they should so completely isolate content moderation questions from those other questions that they never consider those factors at all? And on one level, it's almost like a political philosophy question, you know, of when do we treat a platform like a private actor, where ideally we want them responsive to market forces, and when do we treat them more like a government held to human rights standard? And I think the answer really is somewhere in between. But so much of the scholarship and expertise and pressure, including from me, is over on that human rights side of the balance, that I kind of would like to see more discussion about, when and how companies are supposed to act like companies. The practical version of that question is, about the decision-making process. The opinion says that we want people who know the local political context very well to make the decisions. Nonetheless, those are supposed to be people who are not at all influenced by the local political context. That might be, a difficult spot in the Venn diagram to identify when you're hiring. Similarly, no matter how you structure your organization, if you have all of your content moderators reporting into one senior vice president and all of your public policy government relations people reporting into another, if they want opposite things or are raising opposite considerations, then at the apex, which is the CEO, somebody's going to have to factor in both of those things at once. So I think it's just hard to get away from. And I would like in academic and civil society work to see more thinking about really how you reconcile those things rather than just going towards a human rights standard at every instance. And I will stop there because I know Nate wants to talk about human rights standards.
About the human rights, and I've got a bee in my bonnet about the use of human rights, international human rights law here, and I'm itching to let that be out, and will in a second. But I thought I'd give Michael and Julie an opportunity either to respond to what Daphne said in particular. I think is a good jumping off point, which is what kinds of considerations do you think are permissible for the company here? Does the sort of interest of the firm qua firm have a role to play in some of these? It factor into your decisions, let alone their content moderation decisions. Which of you would like to go first? I see Michael's unmuted.
I'd be happy to go first. I think what Daphne said is quite insightful, but I also think the institutional structure that we have right now is responsive to it. The company is a company. Its job is to make money, and that's not all bad because that means it will be responsive to its users, and the users are people. And there certainly are exceptions, but by and large, the profit motive and the welfare and desires of its users are at least marching somewhat in the same direction. The oversight board is completely the opposite. We don't care whether Facebook makes any money. We are completely outside of that, and yet we are not all powerful with the company. We have, as Marietta emphasized, we have a limited role. We have a limited remit. We can only do certain things, right? And so that means we have both sets of considerations. The company is going to be economic, and the board is going to be non-economic, emphasizing human rights, of which, of course, freedom of expression is near the apex, right? And so we are going to be nudging the company in one direction, but it's not as if that's just going to magically turn it into a system where economics is not taken into consideration. That's still going to be, we're nudging and they're making money. And I think the combination of those things may be better than all of one or all of the other.
If I could add to that, I of course agree with Michael with regards to our limited remit, and of course we're not here to talk about the commercial interest of the company. While that is true, it's also true that the same company, despite its huge commercial interest, has also committed itself voluntarily and announced, with big blog post, a few weeks ago, that it had decided to break down basically what it meant for Facebook to be committed committed to human rights, and how the company is going to apply that. From my perspective, this is an interesting moment to harness and to say, yes, in this world where we all know authoritarianism is rising, those actors that are the primary responsible for applying and for protecting our human rights, those actors tend to become more authoritarian and shy away from protecting those rights. Well, we all have a role to play, including companies. And companies' role cannot be only making money. If they make money and they have an impact on society, how can they also be a positive force for human rights? And I don't think it's incompatible with business interests. On the contrary, speaking here not as a board member, but really as an activist, we have seen that human rights can be actually a competitive advantage for companies, especially when we're talking about the internet. We're not, well, it's the FSI, so we can probably talk also about the geopolitical forces that are involved. You know, there are other Facebooks or equivalents, or at least there are other big technologies that do not necessarily do not necessarily conduct business with, this idea that human rights are important and that human rights actually help you make money. That is a disruptive thinking. And I truly believe that a company in the 21st century, a company who puts that forward, is likely, in my opinion, to make much more money and be perceived more positively in society, provided that it contributes to that society. That's a very personal opinion, not speaking for the board here. But I wanted to rapidly also respond to Alex's very, very important question. What are the trade-offs between, on the one hand, not letting the platform being weaponized, and on the other hand, not getting involved in the democratic processes? That's a balance, a very tough balance to strike. But again, what guides us, and I think what guides also all these democratic processes, is a set of principles that at some point have been agreed upon by virtually everyone on Earth. I say virtually because there are some countries that are not agreed to many of the texts we're talking about. So with this in mind, there's limits that you cannot pass. There are borders that we cannot pass, precisely because of these commitments that we all have, our countries and humanity has committed to respecting, and particularly, of course, freedom of expression, but other sets of human rights. And from that perspective, I think the board really has a role to play in reminding that, these principles also apply on online platforms and on online speech, which is not different from whatever happens offline now. But it's as important to protect it on social media platforms than it is to protect it in the different countries where each government has jurisdiction. So yes, I just wanted to stick to that rapidly.
Well, I'm itching to make the human rights point, but Mauricio wanted to jump in. Mauricio, what did you want to?
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, Michael said at the beginning that everybody is projecting their own views or criticisms onto the ruling of the board. And I feel like the same is happening to the company Facebook. In one context, people say, oh, it's a company, it's going to go after profit. In another context, people will say, well, it's a public square. They're clearly involved in making these decisions and trade-offs that are in the realm of public policy. When does speech threaten public health, public safety? How far should the company look? Only in the United States or elsewhere? Which selection of cases does it make to prioritize? How much effort does it put into it? How many of its billions is it going to invest to be active in different parts of the world? Is it mandated to create something that it itself has called a Supreme Court, which I think is laughable? So I think what we see happening is that these many hats that Facebook is trying to wear at the same time are increasingly clashing. And it leads to questions about whether the company is even capable of doing what it promises itself. So, for example, when it announced after 14 years of not wishing to burn their fingers that it was finally going to deal with Holocaust denial, people would still find Holocaust denial posts or groups or other content on the platform. So my sense is that we have to indeed see the company for what it is: commercially driven, data slurping, advertising, selling billion-dollar company, and therefore not consider it legitimate or qualified to make those public policy decisions.
If I may, though,
go.
I feel like, Marietje, you're contradicting yourself. Like in your opening statement, you talked about correctly that Facebook has taken down content that protests against the Indian government. But then 2 sentences later, you talk about how there needs to be democratic accountability. This is the core of the problem, is that if you ask any of these tech companies, do you follow the law? They say yes. If you ask any of them, do you protect human rights? They say yes. And you can't do both of those, right? And the problem in India is that a properly democratically elected leader is using actual court systems to force Facebook to do things that are against human rights. And so this is why I like the oversight board model, is that governments are not the solution. And we always hear this from our European friends that assume that everything is going to happen in Brussels or Paris or Berlin. But even in the European context, we're going to see things like the Digital Services Act used by the EU members who are now trending towards autocracy. You know, we did a whole report on SIO about disinformation in the Polish election that looks like it was tied to one of the political parties. We're going to see these European laws used in the exact same thing to suppress the rights of minority political speakers. And so, I mean, the oversight board's a crappy model, but I don't see a better one. And I certainly don't think returning this all to democratic legitimacy in individual countries, we're seeing in India why that doesn't work now, unless we want to just say every country gets to make up their own rules, in which case you can get rid of the oversight board. And in the United States, it's the First Amendment. And in India, it's whatever the BJP wants. And I don't think that's actually a good model for anybody. But I don't understand this position of the idea that government should take over at the same time that we criticize Facebook following the laws of governments.
Rich, I think, I got to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Well, I will just be brief, but I don't think Facebook is following the laws of governments. I think they're following their own laws and their own selections of cases, and it's arbitrary. It's one thing one day, it's another thing the other day. And, you know, if they were to align their decisions with universal human rights or with democratic principles or with the US Constitution, I think that would already be clearer than what we see right now, where there's a lot of questions about, you know, how much priority is put into different countries, why, for example, certain risks are taken, et cetera, et cetera. Because if you go into certain countries, like, let me take a random example, a country where there's a history of election violence like Kenya, and you give a platform where people can use it at will to share their messages, hateful or not, true or not, it's going to have an effect. So I really don't think such a principled decision is taken by Facebook throughout.
But could you respond just to Alex's point about India in particular? Because I think all of us do recognize that in some ways that is where the future of the internet's going to be determined. Yeah. So what is what's the right response from Facebook, and how does this make you think about democratic accountability and content moderation?
Well, I think the question is what Facebook promises to do to its users, and so I think it's good if they don't just follow every order to take down a post. And if they don't want to agree with laws that they're forced to agree to, then they have to ask themselves, do they want to operate in that country? It's a decision that tech companies have to make everywhere. You know, does Google want to start a search engine in China if it is forced to censor? Does Facebook want to go into Turkey when the constitution there does not allow insulting of the head of state? You know, these are preconditions that have consequences indeed. And I think no country is perfect. The EU is not perfect. I'm not trying to idealize the role of governments in that sense. But I think that there is a big difference between democratic legitimacy and accountability versus commercially driven motives without such independent processes.
So I do want to use that as a launching pad for my screed a little bit on international human rights law as the touchstone here. Now, I just, for Michael and Julie's benefit, I don't fault the Oversight Board for grounding its decision in international human rights law. After all, that's in your charter, right? So you're basically, directed to do so. And hey, you look for law where you can find it. The problem I see is that, most of international human rights law is not about, it's about, government suppression of individual speech, right? With respect to the free speech section we're talking about here. And Facebook is not actually a government, and the newsfeed is not a public square. It is a highly curated, algorithmically driven, personalized servicing of information to a user base, right? And that presents different considerations than does a government that then clamps down the speech of an individual speaker. And so, for example, the decision that you all had on the on nudity and the French breast cancer video that came out a few months ago seems perfectly plausible to me, as you all suggest, that a government should not be able to ban breast cancer videos, right? I mean, that would violate international human rights laws. But for a company that's looking at 1 billion pieces of content that are flowing over its platform every day, is it so crazy that they shouldn't be able to have a filter, that says no nudity? Yes, it's going to limit some certain kinds of speech, but the concerns that the company has, and I'm not even talking about the economic questions that Daphne was referring to, but just that it's a different question, right? That this is not about, if you want to find nudity on the internet, there are plenty of places you can find it, right? You don't need to have Facebook as the place to do that. And so while what is interesting in the opinion is, yes, most of the discussion of international human rights law is talking about the treaties relevant to government suppression of speech. There is the sections that start talking about the guiding principles on businesses and human rights, but those principles really are not written for the content moderation problem, as you all know. And it is, in many ways, you all are giving content to the international human rights law relating to businesses and human rights. I mean, all of those sort of principles deal with, how the companies should start, any company should think about the environment, should think about the abuse of its consumers, non-consumers, employees, and the like. And so I want to just sort of push you all to explain what role, whether you think that the international human rights precedent dealing with governments can be sort of adopted wholesale in the corporate context that you're dealing with. Julie or Michael, who'd like to start on that? I don't want to. Julie, why don't you start since Michael started before?
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to start. Well, you will see in our decision, this is actually a conversation that we've been having at the board. How should we hold companies to the same standards, basically, exactly. Copy-pasted standards as governments, given that these are indeed just companies and they probably do not have the same means to protect the human rights, and they have, I have a bandwidth problem. I hope you can still hear me.
No, you're perfect.
Okay, thank you. And that's why we have suggested in some of our decisions, first of all, that the dichotomy take down or live up is probably not the only way out there when it comes to content. We've been having this conversation. We've been hinting to that in some of our decisions. And also, yes, we acknowledge that we're talking about a company. So we are absolutely in an uncharted territory, but precisely because we are on this territory, we are listening and yes, reading as much as possible on these issues, and that's why the public comments are very helpful, because they provide additional perspective that probably we may lack internally. So this to say that it's a huge experiment indeed, like my other colleague Ronaldo Lemos usually says. It's a very fascinating one, actually, in which we are trying to craft into paper what does it actually mean in 21st century when you have at your disposal so many tools that did not exist 70 years ago, 100 years ago, when all this text were adopted, how do you actually translate that into into policies that work on social media platforms? And I think one of the ways is recognizing that the dichotomy leading up, taken down in a matter of 24 hours, otherwise you'll be fined, so on and so forth, is probably not the best, always the best framework to look at things. It's a bit more complicated than that. But I think we are at the beginning, and I think the kind of dialogue and conversation we've been having with the companies after we've provided it with recommendations. For instance, we've made some recommendations on automated content moderation, on moderators, adding more human moderation. Well, the company responds to that, and I really like the idea that Alex introduced earlier on, which is it's a question that this conversation is an iteration, and yes, it's important. It's important that it happens in this open way. Yes.
Michael, anything you'd like to add on in terms of the application of human rights law in these contexts?
Well, yes. I mean, I don't think anybody thinks that the same standards apply to Facebook that apply to companies. I'm sorry, that apply to nations when they're exercising their punitive functions, locking people and putting people in jail and so forth. But that doesn't mean that principles of freedom of expression recognized in international law and our First Amendment and other sources don't have application. And if you look at this most recent opinion and see what were the principles of freedom of expression that were invoked, I don't think this is a straitjacket. I think that, so what were they? One of them was clarity, that is, lack of vagueness. Another is understandability, so that users know where they stand, and this is related to not applying new standards sort of on an ad hoc basis retroactively, and one standard to Mr. Trump and another standard to other people. A consistency requirement also comes from both international human rights law, freedom of expression principles, and it's also a principle of freedom of expression in the American free speech tradition too. And I could go on. I think, and the idea of proportionality, which is very similar, not identical, but very similar to the American idea of narrow tailoring. These are not, I don't have any problem saying that they are applicable to Facebook, even though I think it would be crazy to say that the same standards always apply to governments and Facebook. That doesn't. And let me just say one more thing. It's in some ways, Nate, you understate the problem, because there's not only the question of comparing Facebook to governments, but what kind of governmental activity are we even comparing it to? Because it's one thing to say to somebody who's inciting a riot, are we going to throw you in prison for 6 months for an overexcited speech, right? And we want to be very careful about that. It's something else to say that you can use government facilities to spread that speech. Well, maybe we unplug the equipment, right? And in U.S. law, at least, the U.S. First Amendment law, we distinguish between the different capacities in which the government touches speech. So, throwing people in jail is one thing, not funding them is something else. Keeping them out of a public forum. There are all kinds of limited public forums which provide for a reasonable, content neutral, or at least viewpoint neutral rules. I think we need to be sensitive to the way in which what Facebook does is analogous to a number of what I would call non-coercive government interactions with speech. And there, I think the analogies are often going to be quite valuable.
I want to turn to Daphne on that, but let me just add to those. I was specifically referencing the fact that the character of the product itself, newsfeed, and the role that algorithms play in the ordering of information makes it qualitatively different than the Boston Commons, right, where you are regulating people. I'll go on that a little bit, but Daphne, yeah, you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, well, so I started thinking of a question listening to Julie's and Michael's points, which is it seems like maybe the government-esque human rights standards that you're holding Facebook to are mostly the kinds of standards we would apply to a legislature of like how clear must the rules be. And that stands in contrast, I think, to the point Nate was making about automated automation and defining what you see, but also automated decision making, which is sort of an unavoidable part of how platforms decide what to take down or what to demote. You know, they're doing something that would never qualify as due process or fair process in any court in the world. And I think that's unavoidable. And you know, we can nudge them towards something that's fairer and that's better, but it's not going to get to where anybody expects courts to be. And so I wonder how you think about that big picture, but also whether it's a useful distinction to say this is more like the human rights standards we put on legislatures rather than the ones we put on courts.
Julie, did you? I do think that point about how the oversight board's rules can be implemented at scale with filtering is one of the sort of undiscussed things in the oversight board's decisions, frankly, you know, that is really where the rubber meets the road. And at some point, you're going to knock your head against that, and that is really what's going to make this quite different than government rules, because the Facebook is in the business of prior restraints, right? Which is not usually the way we think of how we should think about a lot of these speech rules. So, Julie, did you want to jump in?
Yes, just rapidly. We are putting together a monitoring committee precisely to track the implementation of many of the recommendations that we make, including related to automated content moderation. And I think this monitoring process is extremely important because it can still, with this idea that we try, and by trying, we'll see actually where we can get. With this process, we can start having answers. It is true what the board is doing so far has never been done before. So it's mostly guidance based on an interpretation of what this human rights standards how this standard could translate into concretely, technically, into how the company conducts business of content moderation. But I think with this committee, what we want to do is, yes, monitor, also pay attention to the implementability of whatever recommendations and the decisions that we make. And I think this dialogue is going to be really fascinating from my perspective. I hope that answers, because I had so much in mind at the same time and might have forgotten an idea, actually.
Alex, sure. Alex, you wanted to jump in on the algorithm issue and sort of automated content moderation, maybe?
Yeah, so on the algorithm ranking, I think one of the things that drives me nuts is like everybody loves to talk about algorithms, but this is actually a great example of a situation in which algorithms are pretty much irrelevant, in that the problem with Donald Trump is not that a computer at Facebook is deciding to put it in front of people. It's that tens and tens and tens of millions of Americans decided they wanted to see everything. They intentionally opted in into seeing what he said. And then everything he said would be amplified by other people, both for positive and negative purposes. So this is actually a great example of the non-algorithmically driven issues, which is kind of consistent with what Renee and I found with our election work, which is there's a lot more humans deciding to make things big who have large followings, and people who exercise their free association rights to be associated with those people and to opt into those kind of information sharing regimes, whether they're groups or following people and such. But in doing so are also choosing to be fooled, right? And that's, I think, like there are issues, difficult algorithmic issues that Oversight Board is going to have to deal with, but it's not this one.
I agree with that point on the that with respect to algorithms in this one, but I do think that this is a larger point about international human rights standards and whether you can operationalize them at scale with automation.
And I think that's totally right. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the other thing we got to keep in mind in all this stuff that is kind of weird is that there's not like a lot of parts of the American criminal justice system that aren't important, right? Like every defendant thinks their case is important, right? But the truth is there are billions and billions of automated decisions made every quarter by Facebook that are not controversial at all, and only a tiny number are controversial. And I find this actually to be a really interesting thing that what happens to the oversight board when they theoretically have a view over all of it, but only 0.001% should be of interest, and like how that filtering works to get to that level without the existence of the magistrate and the circuit courts and the Court of Appeals and all the things that exist in the US or in other court systems will be really interesting.
Renee, you actually, I think, had a question on that point, which is just on the process of the oversight board adjudicating those comments or listening to them.
Yeah, I am very curious about that. The question of I started reading through the PDF that the board released of the user submitted comments, and I was curious what that process was like for members of the board who were doing the deciding. To what extent that public opinion is incorporated into the deliberation process.
Michael, do you want to just talk about how the comments work?
So
did you read all 9,600?
I didn't even come
comments?
close. And to some extent, I relied on staff to point out the ones that were worth reading. And I want to say, I bet different members of the board have a different attitude. And it's one reason why it's good to have so many very different individuals on the board. But my attitude is, I don't care how many people say things. I care about what they say and whether it's cogent and sensible and reasonable. And so, there were some public comments that I found extremely valuable, and others, having many thousands of people just saying how much they hate Donald Trump is just not useful.
Julie, do you want to weigh in on how you dealt with the comments? And basically, this also affects us going forward. How active should we be in sending you comments versus publishing a law review article? Yeah.
No, they are read. I promise they're read. I have to admit also that I couldn't really read every piece of comment. We had more than 300 pages, I think, on that PDF, close to 400. I read half, so I'm quite proud of that. But we have an incredible staff that does the work of receiving the comments as they come and summarizing or reading them and summarizing the main points that could, well, first of all, putting aside those that are not consistent with what they say and do not bring anything to the debate, but also putting aside those that do have very detailed and coherent reasoning. So once we have that summary available, we also have the PDF, so we can still go back to that document, but we do have a summary to help us given the time constraints.
So in addition to how you deal with comments, there was, I thought, an interesting revelation in this decision about how you interact with Facebook, right? Which also makes it quite different than a court in that there's this dialogue between you and Facebook throughout the adjudication, right? I mean, Michael, when you were a judge, this would be a kind of different process, I would think, where you frequently would go back and forth. And so what was interesting, I thought, is not only did you ask the certain questions, but Facebook declined to answer some of them. You articulate the reasons in a general way. You articulate the reasons for their denial of sort of cooperation with you all. And so going forward, I think Facebook is on notice that if they don't answer, that will be noted. Now, I don't know whether that makes them more or less likely to cooperate. I could see Facebook, going in a more restrictive direction as a result of this. But on the kind of transparency front, in the future, will you make available, to the public the questions that you ask Facebook and their responses, assuming it doesn't violate user privacy and some other things? There's obviously some legal issues there, but it would seem kind of important in establishing the independence of the board that system of asking questions to Facebook and then Facebook responding might be something that we, would know, because then in a sense, it's part of the record, right? It's part of what may have influenced the outcome in the case. So is that something that you all are thinking about? Maybe I'll go to Michael as board chair on this.
I think it's something we should think about. I actually don't think it's anything we have been thinking about. It's a good thought. I think this was the first case in which I may be wrong about that, but I think it's the first case where Facebook declined to answer questions. Now, part of that is we asked so many questions in this case. There have been other cases where we ask questions, but the number is considerably smaller. So it may be that this particular case calls attention to an interesting. I think what you said makes a lot of sense, but until this case, I don't think that would have been apparent.
Oh, sorry. Who was Daphne? Daphne.
Yeah, I would just jump in and say, I love that you're asking all those questions, even if they don't answer them, just that the board is staking out that it has the authority to ask those questions and hopefully defining a dynamic with Facebook that makes you get more information. So keep up the good work.
Well, what was interesting is that, so go, Julie, go on.
No, I just wanted to say, yes, to Daphne's point, I am confident that this is going to help us get even more information, because I do remember, Michael, some instances in which we didn't get response at the time, but we got response in another way in other cases. So I feel, because these are important, these questions that we ask are important to inform our decisions. So, and I think hopefully the company understands that. So yeah, I'm personally very confident that it's going to help us have more information with regards to moderation at Facebook.
What I found interesting is not only what they responded to, what they didn't, but also the rationales for not responding, right? So that of course, attorney-client privilege, we can kind of understand privacy if that's really an issue. Although I suppose you all have signed NDAs on the privacy issues, so I'm not sure I understand that. Then relevance, right? That they decided, well, the questions were not relevant to adjudicating the Trump case, which would seem to be a pretty important catch-all. But what's developing here is a kind of common law of evidence, right? That is going to apply. Which is enforced by the company. So, whether it's law or not, you can decide. But in terms of what are going to be reasonable requests from the board that Facebook will then respond to. I gather, though, that the bottom line, Michael, is that you felt that in the previous cases and in this case, they pretty much gave the board the information that they needed and wanted. You're muted.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
I was just saying on that, Nate, like the thing I'd love to see more asking for is, without violating privacy, I think there's a fascinating law professor argument here of whether or not showing user data to Michael or Julie would be a violation of ECPA, SCA, or GDPR. I'm sure somebody here could write 150 pages on that, but without getting access to real individual, row level user data, there are groups inside of Facebook that do lots of data science and then come up with conclusions. One of those reports leaked to BuzzFeed about January 6th, and that's exactly the kind of thing that I think it would be great for the board to ask more for. Is I would like a quantitative analysis of how did this product affordance, impact this, and then for that to be released. Because realistically, there's no reason why that report should not have been released by Facebook in the first place, except internal politics. It would be great if the oversight board or a forcing function for Facebook would be more transparent on that stuff, and then you don't have to expose individual user data and therefore run it into the thicket of privacy laws.
Great. Let me ask one last question about what the future holds here a little bit. Right now, I want to ask this both with respect to the Trump case itself, but then also institutionally for the Oversight Board. is it right to read the opinion as suggesting that under any circumstances, Facebook has to come back to you in 6 months? Or is it possible, suppose they decide to reinstate Donald Trump in, well, actually even tomorrow, then is it basically the possibility that, is it within the realm of possibility that then it's going to require a user to file some kind of action about why the account should be taken down in order for this to go back up to you all, or what's the procedure there?
So they're not reporting back to us. They're just deciding this case again, the way they should have originally, and it'll come back to us only if it is raised through one of the ordinary channels, which would be Facebook referral, user appeal, or a third party appeal. If they leave Trump up, third parties can then appeal. So I think those paths are very probable, but one of them would have to be followed.
Now let me ask a little bit organizationally about what the Oversight Board, the future is. Do you have a full complement of members now, or are you now in the business of appointing more? I know our colleague Pam Carlin had to jump off because she's serving in the Biden administration. So Suzanne Nossel of Penn America took her place. But are you still building it out? And what does the next year or two look like from the Oversight Board sort of organizational standpoint?
The plan is to move toward a complement of 40. And the main reason we want more people is so we can have more panels and decide more cases.
And how many are there right now? I forget. Is it 20? 20. Okay. All right. And what role, if any, is Facebook playing in the selection of those? Is this all you all now who are deciding it?
No, under the original charter, Facebook has a role with respect to all of the initial members, and then once we're talking about replacements, they no longer have a role.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank everybody on this panel. Michael and Julie, I know that you are you're doing a road show after this decision yesterday, and I'd say, Michael, as a former judge, I know that's an unfamiliar position for you to be in. And thank you to all my Cyber Policy Center colleagues. You really showed off well for the rest of the world here on what we can produce. I'll say that, and we can put the slide up, the next event on May 26th is with Andy Grotto, who runs the program on geopolitics, technology, and governance. He'll be talking with Nicole Perloff about her book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. So, out of the frying pan into the fire with that webinar. So I want to thank everyone again. Please follow us on Twitter and sign up for the various emails that the Cyber Policy Center has, and look forward to talking to you again in the future.